Hello, everyone. My name is Katrina Rogers. I'm president of Fielding Graduate University, and I'm here to welcome you today to FIELDnotes, which is a series hosted by my office. And today's topic is resilience during COVID-19, reflections for 21st century living. I want to welcome you all for being here today. Many of you are friends of Fielding, graduates, students, faculty, staff, trustees, donors, colleagues, and such from all over the world. And I'm just delighted to know that you're all here today. For those of you who may not know Fielding Graduate University, it's maybe the first time that you've attended one of our virtual webinars. We were founded in 1974 by faculty who had a dream for a different kind of education at the graduate level in the social sciences. And they designed doctoral programs in psychology, organization development, leadership and education and human development, infant and early childhood development, and media psychology across a wide range of disciplines and practice that is predicated for the adult learners and predicated on a notion of more interdisciplinary understanding of scholarship as it applies to practice. And so for those of you who are our guests today, I think you'll see this very strong scholar practitioner orientation as we go through the topic of resilience. Resilience is, of course, one of the terms that you've heard a lot since COVID-19, but in fact, it's been a subject of study for quite some time at Fielding. So first, I'd like to go to our welcome, and I'd like to ask everyone on the call to please put in the chat, if you can hear us, a 2-word check-in about how you're doing today, or how you're feeling right now, if you feel that you would like to do that. It would be a good opportunity to get a sense of the whole. There are many people on this call, and it's a good way for us to check in. I would appreciate that. Thank you. Another reason that we wanted to have this topic today on resilience is that we also want to celebrate the recent publication of a book on the same topic, and we have 2 co-authors today who created this collection, and I know some of you on the call, some of our attendees, also made contributions to this book on resilience. And we'll talk a little, thank you very much. This book is called Resilience, Navigating Challenges of Modern Life, and we'll talk a little bit about that during the course of the webinar. I'd like to also go over the agenda today. So we're going to really focus on a couple of different avenues. The first is to explore personal and family resilience and think about the creative responses that is required of people who are resilient during these difficult times. A chat, we wanted to put a question in the chat, and we'd invite you to please share a story about what you have gone through, how it has changed you, and over the course of your life. All of us have to deal with adversity or situations. Some of these are enormous learning opportunities, particularly as we go on and we begin to integrate experiences into who we are and who we are becoming and evolving as human beings. So we're going to put this question into the chat, and I'd invite you to share a story. We're not going to share the chat publicly, just so you know, but we may use the ideas that emerge in the chat for future topics for FIELDnotes and other Fielding webinars. So just to let you know, that's how that information might be used. Another component we're going to focus on in today's webinar is collective and community resilience for mutual response and action. We're really moving from individual to collective and then to organizational. We'll discuss a little bit about organizational resilience and what are some adaptive strategies as organizations also move through a change process. And in terms of that question for the chat on that regard is what communities are sustaining you right now and what new communities have you created? Now this could be related to COVID-19 or not. It doesn't have to be just that situation. It also is a reflective question meant to help you think through that you may have communities that are obvious in their orientation and definition and frameworks. We often think of, say, a civic community, or there may be an organic community that you've created during times that have helped you build also a resilient strategy. So those will be the 2 chat questions. We'll put them in chat, and then as the chat develops, we will continue to put those questions in chat so you can see them. In addition, for those of you who've become very familiar with virtual webinars, you know that we'll have a Q&A function. So please feel free to put your questions in as we go. We have many presenters today, but we are not going to do a Q&A after each presenter. We will do it at the end of the webinar. And the design of this webinar is we have plenty of time for Q&A. So the presentation will not take up the 2 hours, maybe just an hour, and then we'll move into a Q&A. And we should be able to address all of your questions at that time. In addition, I'd just like to let everyone know that for all the attendees who are here and present today, we will also send you the PowerPoint. We will send you the recording, and we'll send you the Q&A, particularly if there are any questions that we don't end up getting to, we'll be sure to address them post-seminar. And this is what the panelists would like to make sure that we do for you as part of our service and in terms of building our learning community. So now I'm going to go on and move to presenting the panelists that we have today. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to each one of the panelists. So as I've said, I'm Katrina Rogers, president of Fielding Graduate University. I have been at Fielding for 15 years in the faculty, first as an associate dean in the Human and Organizational Development Program, and I'm currently president, albeit this is my 7th year. I came to Fielding after a career in the nonprofit sector and also had been in the academy. And like many people at Fielding, I see myself as a scholar and a practitioner, and that scholar practitioner is what attracted me to Fielding. My field is political science with an emphasis in environmental policy. And my role in today's panel will be to reflect just a little bit on organizational resilience. And I take from my work in ecology the notion of resilience, which is an important element of a diverse and healthy ecosystem. I'd also just briefly like to introduce the rest of our panelists as we start to go through this process. First, Dr. Connie Corley, who is on the faculty in the School of Leadership Studies. In addition, she's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, and she also has had a distinguished career in Cal State LA, is currently emeritus there, and she was named a Distinguished Woman there in 2008. And she's well published in the field of gerontology and also in health and wellness. Dr. Tiffany Fields on the faculty in the School of Psychology. She is also the director of the Touch Research Institute in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Miami School of Medicine, and that conducts research funded by NIH. She's a research scientist with many awards to her name and has been in her own career for well over 30 years. And she's going to speak a little bit today on recent research that was just conducted during this time of the pandemic. I also like to introduce Dr. Marie Sonnet, who is a graduate of Fielding, which we're very proud of that, also runs her own consulting business called Sonnet Organizational Consultant. She's one of the co-authors with Dr. Connie Corley of the book Resilience, and she focuses on building collective resilience. It's a very important topic, particularly when we get to such ideas around community resilience. How do you build in the characteristics that allow communities to manage under difficult circumstances? And then lastly, I want to introduce Ann Townsend, who is a media psychology doctoral student at Fielding and also has been a senior analyst and lead application developer in the public sector. She has many degrees to her name, and when you see the PowerPoint, you will see a more complete biography for all of our participants. And Anne is currently a member of our Inclusion Council at Fielding Graduate University, also serves on student governance. She's going to talk about resilience in indigenous communities today. So with that, I would like to turn over the PowerPoint to Dr. Connie Corley. Dr. Corley?
Esteemed panelists here, I'm really privileged to be part of this program today. And I wanted to thank Fielding, the faculty, students, staff, everyone who's made it possible to do the work that we're doing, especially in this very challenging time, and for the opportunity to work with a stellar group of people who were part of our Fielding Resilience monograph. And hopefully you'll get a chance to take a look at that going forward. So none of us are untouched by COVID-19, but we can navigate adversity through creativity, and through our creativity stay connected with and inspire other people. So for the last 10 plus years, I've been involved in research on resilience, first as a co-investigator on a study of resilience with Dr. Roberta Green, who is Emeriti Professor at University of Texas, Austin. She had funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And one of the 20 interviews that I oversaw out of the 120 interviews that were conducted nationally in the United States, I interviewed Mrs. Erica Leon. And she said to me at the end of the interview, when I told her she reminded me of a family member named Frida, she said, "Well, I can be like Frida to you." So that became the beginning of a very long and deep friendship. And she's really friend, family, much more to me. And at the age of 99, which I'll tell you more about her in a moment, has been navigating much more than the World War II experience, which we're going to talk about in her memoir, Her Story and History. It's archived at the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. And it tells the experiences of her early life, living through World War II in hiding in Hungary and beyond. So on the next slide, you'll see a picture that she drew, a sketch from her memoir. And in this, she's being rounded up and escaped being rounded up going to the ghetto. She's hiding in a phone booth, which right now I suppose would be an anachronism. She's hiding her yellow star with a book. And originally, they left her behind because she had a problem with one of her legs and had quickly wrapped a bandage around it. And the Nazis thought she would be contagious, so they left her behind. And so after they took everybody away, she left the apartment where she had been in hiding, and she wanted to go to this hospital in the background because her husband, her first husband, was there, had been in labor camps and was there working. And when curfew time came, she knew if she was found outside, she'd be shot. So she took her chances, even though there were guards in the front. And it turns out they were Hungarians in Nazi uniforms, and they let her in. She was able to survive the last few months in the war in the basement of the hospital underneath a box. And so this is just one of many stories of her creative responses and her resilience that allowed her to navigate adversity. So in the next slide, you'll see that she has continued to share her story, not only in her writing, but also in sharing paintings. Her second husband, who she came to marry, had been her long lost fiance from before the war. He left Hungary, and then they reconnected. He lived in Los Angeles and was the art instructor at the retirement community where she eventually moved in with him. So they got married many, many decades later after they were originally engaged. And she created hundreds of paintings, sketches, and has been the subject of many presentations and writings, of which you'll see in the references at the very end of the slides. Several of my articles there that include Erica Leon. And she was presenting at a Positive Aging Conference, which Field had been the sponsor of a while back here in Los Angeles. And on the next slide, as I mentioned, she wrote her life story, Her Story and History. After being stuck in Hungary, she would go back every summer after getting married in 1991. So 10 years later, she's in Hungary on 9/11, and then all the flights were canceled. And because that triggered so much trauma for her, she decided to write her life story. So her memoir, Her Story and History, as I mentioned, is archived at the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. So now she's facing a whole new level of trauma, being confined. She's in a nursing home now, and so she's not able to get visitors. All the activities are canceled, even though she can't paint anymore because of her arthritis. there are no classes and activities. And so we've managed mostly through phone calls and a few virtual visits. If you see on the next slide, I think a lot of our interactions that we've enjoyed over the years, sitting side by side, being out in nature, we can only imagine. And she said to me last week, we were able to do a FaceTime call, and she said she wants to live long enough to be able to thank everybody in person for all the kindness that she's received from people sending notes and cards and gifts to her. So who knows when we'll be together again. So on the next slide, I decided my own personal resilience could be met by doing something creative that would be of value to other people. And I had been a radio announcer on a show called Experience Talks on KPFK in Los Angeles, and it's now on hiatus probably forever. But for over 10 years, I had a monthly program and rotated with other people. So then I got the idea for doing a podcast, and it's called Love Goes Viral. Let's think about something positive going viral. And love, how can we go wrong with love? So to address my own isolation and loneliness, one of my guests is the head of Social Isolation and Loneliness Coalition that I represent Fielding on here in Los Angeles. And it's been said that social isolation and loneliness is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Well, thankfully I'm not a smoker, and I certainly didn't want to get into the negative consequences here. So in addition to interviewing Maureen Feldman, who runs this coalition and has a program that she created through AARP funding, led by Dr. Scott Kaiser at the Motion Picture and Television Fund, they call it the Daily Call Sheet. So I wanted to share how they've already been helping people who are isolated through simple phone calls. I've also interviewed through Fielding HOD alum Dr. Paige Mars and her husband Don Mars. They have books they've written together, and they've been living and working together for many years. So we've talked about their work called The Love Conversation and how to keep love alive during quarantine. Margie Worrell, one of our HOD students, has just launched a book, was supposed to be on a non-virtual book launch going to the United States from Singapore, but instead she was in quarantine because her husband ended up with COVID-19 and spent a month in the hospital. So we talk about that experience. And then there's a fourth interview called Conversations on Love and Dying with Mirabai Bush, who co-authored a book with Ram Dass, the late Ram Dass. So lovegoesviral.org, you'll get information if you're interested. On the next slide, the night before lockdown in California, I was at the beach. And when I saw this image of this crack of blue in the sky, and the word rainshine came to me, so I looked it up. And somehow this notion that if we can just see through nature metaphors and encouragement and inspiration. So the idea of standing below the clouds in the midst of the mist, being able to see the blue sky above. So I want to develop some kind of program. I'm calling it Rainshine, and rain is resilience amplified in nature to allow me and others to continue to shine. And finally, you'll see on the next slide, the next morning, which is the day I ended up driving back home where I've been for the last 2 months, I saw this seagull, probably a different seagull, on a rock way above the waves. And we often think of our lives as being tumultuous like waves, but if you imagine that deep below the waves of the ocean, there's calm and peace, and life is thriving there. So if we think of that kind of resilience within ourselves, of being able to soar while we're also calm underneath, I like Erica, find hope and inspiration in nature. And when we're all done, I'm going to read a quote from Erica that's in another Fielding monograph, the Fielding Scholar Practitioner, where she talks about having hope and the role of nature and music. And that's my experiences and my family by virtue of being connected with Erica in our friendship about how to have creative responses to adversity through resilience.
Thank you, Dr. Carly. I think that's a really nice connection between someone's individual experience and then this more, how do we bring that into our own understanding and help develop tools in this regard for our own lives and our own situation. I want to thank all the many people who put comments on chat. I've just made a quick list of several of them, and you can really see the range of emotions and also some of the experiences that people are dealing with these days. So these are some of the comments or some of the nouns that were used in adjectives: frustrated, sad, optimistic, sad, doing poorly, doing great, feel confused, doing well, I'm in a holding pattern, I'm interested, I'm curious, I'm tired, confused, I'm starting self-quarantining today, it's the first time loss of job, I have friends or family members who are in harm's way, someone on the USS Teddy Roosevelt, others who said that they have family members or know people of COVID-19. So it's clearly a very difficult time. And also, though, I share that it's not uncommon to be holding both positive and negative emotions at the same time. In a New York Times article in today's paper, as it happens, there's a discussion of resilience. And one of the things the author points out, or one of the characteristics, is the importance of being able to have the kind of emotional complexity that you can hold both positive and negative emotions at the same time. And I think that's really an important idea to keep in your mind as you hear the different presenters today, because it's how can you navigate through what feels like an ongoing paradox of what you're seeing, what you're observing, what you're feeling, and what you're experiencing, and how can you take from that and continue to help build your own strength and by proxy the strengths of others that you interact with. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tiffany Field, who's going to talk a little bit about her most recent research.
Okay, I want to congratulate Dr. Corley on her presentation. I think that Erica's story is very inspirational. And while you talked about creativity to navigate, I'm going to talk about exercise to navigate. So what I did during COVID, or when COVID started, I was getting a lot of calls from the press, and their first question was, are we experiencing touch deprivation? And the second question was, what about all the people who are alone? Are they really experiencing touch deprivation? And so we started a research practica. You know, like everybody at Fielding, when they get a very important question, they go to their students and they start a practica. And before you know it, there is a survey being conducted or some kind of research. And I want to acknowledge that Samantha Pauling, who's one of the Fielding students in psychology, she put up a flyer on Facebook with a link to SurveyMonkey. And we put our survey up there. And Sean Miles has been doing a lot of the data analysis. And Dr. Deborah Brendel and Dr. Connie Vesey have also been working with our research practicum on this. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. And if we can go to the first slide, if you don't want to look at all these numbers, I just want to say that the take-home message from this survey was the biggest problem, although we thought it was going to be touch deprivation, was sleep problems. And the biggest buffer seems to be exercise. When we do a correlation analysis on exercise, we're only at the correlation analysis stage at this point, we find that exercise is positively related to every positive experience people are having and negatively related to every trauma or emotional disturbance they're having, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, and sleep problems. So that's the take-home message here. I'll tell you a little bit about the sample. So far we have 260, the mean age is 47. 75% of the sample are female, and I'm being told that this happens to be sort of the demographic of many of the samples that are on SurveyMonkey. So I don't know what it is about females, but we're all responding to SurveyMonkey. 78% were non-Hispanic white. And then they were distributed across a few categories: 33% academics, 33% office workers. The rest were medical folks and laborers. 28% were home alone, which is a huge, huge number that we're very concerned about. The average income, $71,000. The unemployed were 25%. So then we looked at their activities, and we looked at this list reflects the activities that were reported for a large percent of the sample. So as you might imagine, social distancing was occurring at 91% of the folks, washing hands 85%, cooking 75%, and a lot of you can relate to that, and housekeeping 70%, internet 100%, not surprising. Messaging about the virus, communicating concerns and questions, 48%. Connecting with friends, a big number, 65%. On Facebook, 66%, and texting, 80%. So then in the next slide, we asked about what their experiences, their feelings, and their worries were. And a lot of these questions were basically stimulated by the press questions that were coming at us with fury, radio shows and newspapers, etc. And mostly from English-speaking countries, which I thought was really interesting because of the question touch deprivation. When you think about the French being more touch deprived because they do all that kissing on each of their cheeks. And we had been doing an airport gate study where we were looking at social interaction and finding that 98% of the time people were on cell phones. So despite the fact that a lot of English-speaking people have been doing cell phones and not a whole lot of touching before this happened, those were the people who were calling us, the English-speaking countries. So on the experiences, feelings, and worries, and this is for the last 7 days reported by the, and these are percentiles of people reporting. Sleep problems, as I mentioned, the biggest problem, 71% of people reported sleep problems, and very, very big sleep problems, like not being able to go to sleep, waking up multiple times, not being able to go back to sleep. Fatigue was another one, 68%, anxiety, 73%, media, 100%. And this was kind of interesting. This was a multi kind of response to this question. They were engaging in more connecting via the media, but they were also experiencing more stress and anxiety related to the media. Liking being at home, 90%. This was also reflective of a sort of ambivalence because liking at home was 90%, but when you wanted the experience to end, that was also 90%. So people were very ambivalent about being at home, but also wanting the experience to end. Cabin fever, 54%, lonely, 43%, feeling isolated, 58%, bored, 45%. Wanting experience to end, I already mentioned that, lonely 43%, feeling isolated 58%, worried about getting the virus. I went over the feeling touch deprived, which was 42%. Touching kids, surprisingly low at 30%, but remember 21% of this sample were, 28% were home alone. So they didn't have kids. Touching the partner, 29%, exercise, 28%, worried about getting the virus, 50%, worried about financial status, which was surprisingly a little lower at 43%, and being reminded of a stressful event, 37%. So then we looked at correlation analyses on potential buffers, and based on those preliminary analyses, as I mentioned, exercise was the one that was related to everything. Touching family members was also high on that list. Connecting with friends was very, very frequently responded to positively. Having a routine, reducing time on media, and getting better sleep. So those were basically the results that we got. Now, some people are interested in qualitative, and we had an open-ended question at the end of the survey that basically said, have you had any positive experiences during the last 7 days of COVID-19? And the SurveyMonkey does an interesting tally of the words that are most frequently used. And the most frequent word was time at 22%, then family at 11%, home at 10%, learning at 7%, work at 6%, and people at 6%. So these are rough data. They're preliminary data, and we're going to continue in our research practica to analyze these data and hopefully present them at the poster session at the Fielding virtual session that's happening in July. And I think they're interesting data. They basically say that we have sleep problems and we need to do exercise. So I wanted to follow up on Dr. Corley's exercise to navigate, in addition to creativity to navigate. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Field. And that's excellent to see research in real time and so quick and responsive to this very important topic. And I think it not only has relevance for individual resilience, but you could also think about not the specifics around the experiences, but things around the potential buffers as also people can navigate complicated organizations as they think about what do they need in order to keep balancing. As I think we're all beginning to realize, it's just that this pandemic isn't going to be an ongoing situation. And so starting to understand that as more, as not a discrete episode, but rather something that may emerge and reemerge over a period of months. How do we start putting into place the kinds of routines that help us build those potential buffers? I just want to see if there are any anything else you want to add, Dr. Field, before we go on to the next presentation?
Yeah, I would like to, because everyone is now, today I talked to the scientist, whatever that magazine is. And so now that we're approaching the end of the, not the end of this pandemic, but sort of ending the stay at home, the questions are more directed at what's going to happen at the end. And I don't think we're going to go back to hugging and shaking hands because there's too much worry about transmission. And besides which, it's become a very ambiguous kind of concern, like how do we know when someone wants to hug us? Do we have to ask permission? If we shake hands, do we have to bring out our sanitizer? So I think I saw a lot of elbow bumping going on, and I thought it looked cool. People were smiling and laughing and just enjoying the experience and having a lot of eye contact. So it was not just a physical thing, but also an eye contact thing. And the other really quick thing I want to say is that I think that people who are home alone have been compensating for the lack of tactile stimulation by doing exercise. And we know now that a lot of physical response to being touched is ultimately helps our immune system because it knocks down our cortisol, our stress hormones. And so I'm suggesting to people who are home alone to walk around the room, to wash their hands. That's stimulating the pressure receptors in the hands, and to do as much stretching that they can do and stimulate the same pressure receptors that are being stimulated by touch. It's not as good as having someone give you a back rub, but it's important if you're all alone. Okay, well, thank you. I suspect there'll be a lot of questions in the Q&A for you, Dr. Field, and
And there's some very interesting connections between these different experiences and how they may interrelate. For example, your point about exercise could also contribute to better sleep. So it does seem like there's a lot of interesting connections there to study and consider. Now I'd like to turn over the presentation to Dr. Sonnet, who's going to speak more directly to collective and community resilience. Dr. Sonnet.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
We got a little challenge. Well, listen, I want to first of all thank Drs. Corley and Field and President Rogers, of course, for their insightful and provocative comments, and then say hello to everyone. You know, when I think about the story that Connie tells about her friendship with Erica and the activity data that Tiffany just shared, I think of how everyday things that happen between us are actually so vital. They contribute to a capacity for endurance, for joy, creativity, and love, even in the most difficult circumstances. Resilience is a characteristic that captures this human ability. It's studied in individuals, and it's also studied as a collective phenomenon, being resilient together, built and activated as we experience life together. And as with many things that we can't actually see in the literal sense, we use metaphors to describe them. For example, I see collective resilience as a combination of capabilities we build up as we interact over time, a kind of stored or potential energy, to borrow a concept from physics. The capacity for collective resilience is a stored asset, ready when needed, hard to produce suddenly, and it can accrue to systems: family, school, church, company or organization, community, even our global ecosystem. And then when there is change, challenge, or adversity, this potential or stored energy is activated. It shifts into kinetic or released energy that enables communities of people to act in ways that, certainly in a crisis, help stabilize function and invent solutions. And isn't this what we're seeing right now in our hospitals, our factories, our schools, food delivery systems, our neighborhoods, and our families? And rather amazingly, we are both spending a stored resource and replenishing it. Resilience is like that. When we use it, we increase our confidence that we have it, and resilience is strengthened. This shared learning, a learning loop, is a hallmark of collective resilience. As we use it, we are strengthened for the next challenge and the next. So a question I have is, what if we did this deliberately? If we deliberately talked about, assessed, and strengthened our collective resilience capacity? So I've used this metaphor of stored resources in a bank account or a well-stocked kitchen. When we need to respond to challenges, we have something in the bank that we can use to respond to adversity. You know, we're ready. We have a collective capacity for resilient behaviors. There are other metaphors to consider. So we'll show that first slide. I like especially to think of Anne Maston, who called resilience ordinary magic. She says that it appears to come from basic human adaptational systems. The magic is in her words, the power of the ordinary. And as such, resilience is a resource that we can confidently tap into to overcome astonishingly bad circumstances and events, including persistent entities with evil intent or just terrible impact. Authors in our monograph speak of the Holocaust, abuse against women, prejudice and discrimination, and organizational persecution. Of course, we're all experiencing a pandemic. Another metaphor is from Diane Kutu, who called resilience a puzzle of human nature, like creativity or the religious instinct. And this is very provocative. She defined it as a skill and capacity to be robust under conditions of enormous stress and change. How, though, is this collective power constructed? I mean, unless we figure out how it's generated, it's very hard to deliberately assess and strengthen it, to mobilize and use it effectively. what is happening between us that creates collective resilience capacity? And I like this metaphor of a dynamic social network. And think of each of us as a node or a nexus, a kind of cell tower. And together we are constructing something bigger and more powerful than we can realize, than we may realize. Important, often unrecognized things are happening as we interact with each other. So what specifically might be happening between these nodes? And that's the next slide. I found that we are building up collective resilience capacity as we do specific everyday things like these listed here, especially if these behaviors are recognized, modeled, and supported. And in practice, of course, they can be deterred. Are behaviors like these, telling stories, calling upon expertise no matter title, sharing what we know, taking ownership, cultivating partnerships, using our shared values to guide our actions in real and genuine ways, putting our experiences together in novel ways? Are behaviors like these happening regularly in groups where you live and work? Do you ever talk about their importance? I think we can foster them with greater value and intention. And President Rogers now will talk more specifically about opportunities in organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sonnet. I really appreciate, if we could linger on this last slide for a minute, really appreciate your presentation and some of the work that you've done to really help think about how do you build up what you need so you can draw from it when you need it. And I think that's something that we often forget. I saw reflected in the chat a couple of ideas around being tired, just going all the way to the end of your reserves and then needing to recharge. I think those are really important aspects of developing resilience. And as you pointed out, yes, I'd like to go to the next slide and talk just a little bit about organizational resilience. And we will also, we said after this presentation, we will certainly give you a set of resources so you can also study at your leisure and for your own thinking across all of the topics that we've discussed today. And I'll include some sources related to organizational resilience. And for this, just for this exercise, I thought it was useful to take an appreciative inquiry framework. Many of you know appreciative inquiry, but for those that you don't, it's a way of approaching, it's a kind of mindset to approaching any given change initiative or sometimes even a conversation, which is considered a way of being, if you will, where you are open and curious and your line of inquiry is very much a set of questions that allows you to investigate or work with either one person in conversation or in a group or within an organization or perhaps even in your own community. And the framework here, just presenting today very simply, is that notion of discovering, dream, designing, and deploying. And so simply put, it's as you move through, say, you know you're about to encounter enormous change within an organization, you seek to discover what works well. So rather than adopting a deficit mindset about what doesn't work, you look at what are your strengths are. So sometimes this is also called strengths-based asset inventory. Many of you have run across this throughout your careers and your work in the things that you do. And that's to really play to those strengths and really focus in on them. And also by doing that, it also activates that part of your brain around creativity too, because it opens yourself up to more possibilities. So it may be seen as an optimistic frame, but that's an optimistic, not in a sort of a glam kind of set or a glow or sort of a glow that you don't understand reality, but rather that you really are seeking to dig deep as to what are your strengths and why these strengths within an organization. And the second is dream. So that follows from discovering, from identifying your strengths. You follow from that what could you then take that strength into a different setting, into a new process, into a different system, into some other aspect of the work. And that's that connecting what you already do well with what could be your future. And then designing to actually say, okay, let's take these two aspects, what we do well and what we could do well, and figure out what we can try. Often design in this context is in a bit of an experimental frame, that you want to choose processes that you think could work well, and you also want to open yourself up to the prospect of success, which of course opens you up to the prospect of failure. So often this is within an organization, you experiment. You may do a pilot or a small aspect of a change and see how it lands, what the second order effects are before you go on to the larger scale change. And then of course that gets you to deployment, right? Deployment is actually taking action on the design. So it's a very simple way to think about it. As I said, I'll send you a list of references for those of you who want to explore in more depth, but it provides a way of thinking about resilience within an organizational context. So in the next slide, what I talk about is some examples of this. So these are just some examples from different organizations over the years that I've worked with or studied or taken from the literature. So you'll be able to see some of these ideas probably from your own work life or certainly from research in this arena. So what you look at is what are some of the things that you have seen that fit into the framework. So for example, here's a way of thinking about it within any organization. So in the discover, where are we and what are our strengths? You can build awareness of what are our risks, what are our opportunities, how can we overcome our fears, how can we unfreeze the frame, which is a common term in the research. How do we build positive energy? What are fears? I saw that on the chat in terms of how do we listen for the fears that are reflected in an organization, not just in an individual level, but even on an organizational level? How can we help build more positive energy around that? How do I identify our current strengths? Sometimes things we think of our strengths maybe aren't. You know, is there a way to or sometimes things that are weaknesses are strengths? And of course, a lot of times our strengths can also reflect certain shadow sides. That sometimes they're the things that make us more vulnerable as well. And so from an organizational perspective, how can we actually think through that? You know, write it down, talk it through, get as nuanced as possible an understanding of your organizational strengths. In terms of dreaming, think about what are the desired benefits of any change. Clearly, it's not change for change's sake. There's something that's motivating that change. Maybe it could be reducing your deficits or your waste, improving your efficiency, improving output, being better, being more sustainable, being more responsible if you're in a corporate sense, in the sense of corporate social responsibility. How can we, if it's an organization that has customer base, how can we do better for our customers, better by our customers? How do we manage our suppliers better? How do we become the kind of partner and establish a sort of relationship with other organizations in which we have influence? And how do we do that in not only a very ethical way, but if we're doing this in a change way, what are the desired benefits that we want from these kinds of changes? Same with employee satisfaction, or if we want greater market share. It's this sense of we're acting out of a dream, right? A desire to have a change that's to the benefit of the organization, but connecting that to more of a reservoir of integrity in how we conduct business, how we conduct our organizational life. And then it's about, in this part, how to shape that individual and organizational commitment to change. So you can take, for example, from Dr. Sonnet's wonderful sense of these metaphors, and you can do the same in organizations. Like what's the metaphor that we're using here that helps shape our individual and organizational commitment to this change process? And then committing to that is eventually in the deployment phase, but it's that important understanding of what is the metaphor here? What is the ways in which we want to shape our narrative? And then in terms of design, this is really where you see this very clearly in organizational life and organizational resilience. It's about figuring out all the new system processes every step of the way. What are the skill sets needed? What are the timelines? Everybody's clear about the benefit. I mean, this is in an ideal organization, no, I haven't run across an ideal organization yet, but it's these temporal strengths that really build, really create a resilient organization. Defining what success is. Then using, as I mentioned before, that kind of staged implementation, right? You test, you learn, you keep upgrading, you test, you learn. And if you can develop that kind of learning community and learning culture, then you do have the toolkit, you do have the set that you're building it as you go. And as Dr. Sonnet pointed out, you can pull from the bank when you need it. And organizations that can do that or do that quickly and well, or over time, they learn how to roll with change, then you'll see that those organizations are often the most agile and often the most capable and able to really rise to any given challenge. And then lastly, it's that implementing the full changes. So design flows a little bit into execution, into the deploy, and vice versa. There's an interconnection there. And that's implementing all the changes across the whole organization. To do that, you really have to understand as early as the dream phase, what are those second order consequences and impacts of any given change. And that is complex. It's hard to do. So I have no illusions about how complicated it is to build true organizational resilience. And you always have to measure success and adjust, measure success and adjust. And that learning and continuous improvement will serve the organization, not just in the particular change process that you may be implementing or interested in, but when things happen, right? When things come at you from the external environment. And obviously there are things that, I mean, it would be naive of me not to mention the current impact of the economic impact on so many organizations. Clearly, there are on occasion those kinds of events that there's very little an organization to do. But even in that, you'll see that there are ways in which organizations have been able to turn. So an example is restaurants who are suddenly under stay-at-home orders, how many are able to do limited takeout or change their menus or do delivery or open up their food service for the local food bank or have a combination of both, feeding hospital workers and offering takeout to the public. So that's just one small example, but it's an example of trying to make a pivot during a very difficult moment and a crisis situation for, in this case, a small business, but you can see that also as a kind of collective as an organization. So I think I'll pause here and we can come back to other points I could raise in the Q&A when we get to it. And of course, I'll look at the chat in the next few minutes, but I want to thank you for your time. And I'm now going to turn the conversation over to Ann Townsend, our doctoral student in media psychology, who's going to speak to resilience in indigenous communities and what lessons can be drawn from looking at these at very different and multiple perspectives. So Ms. Townsend?
Greetings, everybody. I come from a lot of different types of communities, and I've had to kind of struggle to find mine for a lot of reasons. I've got MS, so I'm in that community, but who wants to like volunteer for that? I'm part of the LGBTQ community, and I'm really proud of the community that I found here at Fielding. Program director, all of my advisors, and the student body is just amazing to me. And all of us are supportive of one another. As new students will find that's how you make it through. So today, though, I'm going to talk about indigenous peoples. It's based in my experience because I pay attention to things that are going on in the world, but also because of living in Hawaii for several years and being a part of that community, which is very interesting from a minority point of view. For the first time ever, I wasn't a minority, and it really gives you some interesting perspectives. First slide, please. Indigenous people around the globe have suffered removal from traditional lands and territories, subjugation, destruction of their cultures, discrimination, widespread violations of their human rights. Some nations have been obliterated by other nations interested in short-term gains and motivated by how the people or the lands could benefit the conqueror. Despite this, most indigenous groups are still represented today, not because of the generosity of others, but because these indigenous people collectively see things differently from their previously European counterparts. The idea of surviving to indigenous tribes and nations is a different concept than that of the Western European cultures. It is not about conquering and short-term gains, but about being aware of the world around them and balancing between yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And they dance. The nations indigenous to the Americas don't live as individuals, but as part of a collective. That collective includes community members, alive and dead, animals, and the land. Their concept of time and history is different from that of those who have settled these lands. Within the tribal family, or in the case of Hawaii, ohana, stories of times past, lessons learned, and truths are shared between elders and those younger, and they dance. Tribes came together as a nation. Nations of people came together as a forum to work together toward securing their rights and the rights of their lands. In the words of Michelle Obama, speaking to a group of Native American college students, you have to believe that right now does not define what will be. Today, nations gather to celebrate their common ideals in dance. In their varied cultural dress, they dance. They dance to chase away the things that go bump in the night. They dance to celebrate the light that brings them health and the land that supports them. They dance to be close to the wise and honored ones who have gone before them. When we talk about thriving communities, every day people of indigenous nations make choices. First world, or in the case of the Hawaiian perspective, imperialistic concepts of sympathy do not relate to their experience. They choose to bend, not to break. They thrive by celebrating their culture and identity as a community. My experience in Hawaii, particularly from 1990 to 1996, is not transferable to other nations. It's not even relatable to the experience of other Haulis, white or otherwise, because they identified in me a person that was common to them in the soul. Much like other communities, when it comes to people outside their immediate tribes, what matters are common values, the things one honors and holds above oneself. Some communities are built on common interest. Some are built on stories. My communities are pretty colorful. How are your communities being resilient and thriving? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I think that's a wonderful opportunity to think about some of the ideas and notions reflected in chat around the second part of our question. And you remember the second question was, what communities have you built and have sustained you? And I just offer you to review the chat as you're engaged in the webinar and as we go into the Q&A, because I think it's very important to think creatively about our communities or the ways that we've re-engaged. For example, there was one point on chat about going back into a religious conversation that now is available on Zoom and reconnecting from maybe something that the decades past for you now, or reconnecting in a whole different way to some very foundational ideas in your family life and in your own systems and own communities. I also think there was an excellent point about chat around communities in talking about organizational resilience, bringing that into what about communities and more broadly even society, and what could we be thinking about in terms of societal resilience. I'd like to now go ahead and let's talk about the Q&A. So I'd like to see if there are questions from the moderators that you'd like to make sure the presenters address.
Sure. Allison asks, and has a question about Tiffany's sample size on Facebook and wonders if that is to her friendship group. If so, would that be a self-selective population? Tiffany, do you have access to a greater community sample size that would reflect more diversity?
Thanks for the question, Dr. Field.
Yes, I appreciate that question, and I was a little bit stunned myself because I have never really done a survey monkey survey. But I have been told that the sample that we got was pretty representative of most survey monkey studies, which is that it's mostly female and most non-Hispanic white. And so if you're going to go and use the survey monkey, you know, that's sort of where you are. And we have to explore other ways to get in touch with people to have this be a more representative sample. So I really appreciate your comment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Field. Appreciate that. And that's a good point. That certainly it's of limited sample size, but we also know that we have now social scientists have access to big public databases. I mean, I know a lot of researchers who look at things like Twitter and what is said on LinkedIn and what is said on Facebook and do content analysis over various words and various understandings, and that there's a wonderful, rich resource there with literally, I think, infinite numbers of potential dissertation topics for those of you who may be looking for dissertation topics, but also for those of you focused more generally on different kinds of research. So another question from moderator.
We have an anonymous question here. After all shared, can we have a common definition of resilience and factors that can activate it?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. I think I'd look to Dr. Corley first and see if I know you and Dr. Sonnet looked at this in terms of the book that you wrote, and perhaps you'd like to weigh in first on that question.
It's a great question. And when I first started doing this research and preparing for publication, I thought, well, what would be some, what was the existing research? And 10 years ago, well, more than 10 years ago now, but that was when I had the first of 2 articles published. A lot of the literature was originally on resilience in children, like how did they survive difficult circumstances and grow into healthy adults. And since that time, the word resilience, as Marie will attest to, and I'll ask her to speak to this as well, it's used in a lot of different contexts. And I think it would be difficult to have one definition, but I would refer you when we get to the end and the resources you'll have in the bibliography. Dr. Roberta Green developed something called, I'm sorry, I forget what it stands for, but it's a resilience model that's based in systems theory and person environment theory. And I think if we were to look at resilience coming in different levels and different capacities, as well as say an innate sense of resilience, as well as how resilience can be nurtured and strengthened. And so I want to turn to Marie Sonnet because a lot of her work is on the capacity for resilience, and she may have a different answer than mine.
Oh, thanks, Connie. No, that was an excellent answer. And I would say too, as it's such a good question, that there are many definitions out there of resilience. So we do have to, as we learned, Connie, we have to sort of say, well, what is the definition, the definition that we're using, the definition in use. And I offered one there from Diane Kutu, but I would like to probably add that it's the ability in difficult or changing circumstances to stabilize in the moment, and at the same time be inventive, so that you can continue with purpose, authenticity, and confidence in perhaps reinventing in the moment, because you've got problem solving often that we have to do, and that we have to do with others in difficult circumstances. And at the same time, generate this shared learning. It's a shared learning process. So for example, the literature used to say resilience was bouncing back. bouncing back. It was using, actually came out of, rubber bands in physics, that the elasticity was an early model, and that you could stretch the rubber band and it would come back. Well, we don't so much talk about bouncing back anymore. There's a bouncing forward, because with each one of these opportunities, we're whether it's individual, community, organizational, we're learning as we go through these, building our resilience, but also building that capacity for the next time. So stabilizing and inventing for shared learning, with that mode of shared learning, is probably a good way to think about it. Helpful way to think about it.
How about other panelists? Dr. Fields, would you weigh in here as well?
I think that you're exactly right. Resilience is what we all have if we just think about it and dream about it and figure out how we can do it best. One of the things I was most impressed by in our COVID survey was how many individual differences there are, and how we all think about this differently, and we all have different approaches to finding resilience. And I think tonight it's been very well represented by all the speakers and the different forms of resilience, and how we can have that.
Thank you. Thank you. Anne, any thoughts from your perspective?
I think the host has stopped my video. I think that one of the main things is about how you react to it, no matter what kind of thing that is that's occurring. When I went blind in 2006, I think it was, I had to figure out how, because it was such a real possibility that I could lose my sight permanently, I had to figure out really quickly how I was going to react to it. And I could feel sorry for myself, but I had to wait for that for sure. Because I had to figure out, okay, I've got a job, I've got kids. At the time I was in a long-term relationship with my partner and her 3 children. I was responsible for all of them. So how do I keep making money and be blind at the same time? And thankfully, because I work with computers, that was something that was even more possible. Either I would go into writing permanently and I don't live off the system, which would really bother me. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but my personal thing is I'm not really great at taking helping hands from anybody, government or otherwise. So I had to make a choice. And when things weren't going right at work and I felt like I was being discriminated against, I had to make a choice. And it's not an easy one, because I'm leaving a job I've had for 12 years. But it's healthy for me to leave that. It's healthier for me to be of this mindset. And so I have to figure out, whatever that mindset is, I've got to figure out how to do that. And it takes work, and I'm not healthy in many, many ways. I'm dysfunctional in many, many ways, but I also know that I am, and I guess that helps too. So how you choose to deal with things, and knowing that you have a choice, and I know it sounds so ridiculous. I remember my parents telling me, you can choose how you feel. Yeah, it's really hard to hear that, but we do have choices. And so I found a place where I could put my energy that wasn't being rejected for stupid reasons like my gender, or that I was high strung and high maintenance. So, you make a choice.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that personal story too. I think that I'm thinking about resilience too, in terms of going back to ecological, what constitutes a healthy ecosystem. And one aspect of it is resilience. And you can think of resilience as the ability, in this case, to absorb adverse conditions and still be able to go on, right? Still be able to not only live, but also thrive. And I that's what your story and tells me about ecology. And in the same way, I think that's in a way there is adaptation is sort of the forward motion. Resilience to me is this motion of taking in, absorbing, building a self-awareness to be able to say, sure, stuff happens and it's you, but sometimes the only thing you can control is how you think about it, because you're going to feel what you feel. But that's not easy to do. So it's that ability to absorb and then move forward and out. So there's some metaphor in there that I'm sure Dr. Sonnett could find for us that would really speak to that. And I think the beautiful slides you showed of the communities and their resilience is a really good example of that, both absorb resilience and move out into adaptation. And there are some wonderful things in the slides. For instance, the juxtaposition of ancient ceremonies on modern streets. I mean, what a beautiful way to think about resilience, right? We survive, we thrive, no matter what the circumstances. All right, I'm going to look to the moderators to see if there are any what other questions there may be.
Robert asks, what are your thoughts about helping professionals and clients paying attention to how and what information do we focus on knowing our patient styles?
Really great question. I think those are good questions for both Dr. Sonnett and Dr. Field. Dr. Sonnett, did you want to speak a little bit to that question?
Yes, and just and tell me who asked that question, because I'm going to look at it in the Q&A and just make sure I have the Pablo who asked that question.
Robert, last name, if correctly,
Okay. McCafferty. It looks like my video. I'm looking at a question from Robert McCafferty, and it says, what are our thoughts about helping professionals and clients pay attention to how and what information we focus on knowing our patients' styles? And I'm going to answer that with some thought about how resilience is assessed individually, and I think even collectively, with a very a fine tuning to where that person or that collective or that organization is at the moment. Where are we right now? Where are our clients right now? What is the as is state of things? And that assessment is really important, because we're saying, and I think someone had mentioned it in chat, that there is a level of resilience in everyone and in entities, as we discussed them today, communities and companies and other types of systems. It can be low. It can be low, and the going research says that it can be that level can be assessed, and then we can strengthen it. There are strategies to both assess and strengthen. So I would say we need to know, our helping professionals need to be able to see where are we right now along the dimensions of resilience, and where and how then, and there are very specific things they've well developed, especially in the literature on individual resilience, about what we can do to help our clients to strengthen those areas and become more resilient. I hope that answers the question.
So I have a slightly different take on that from the sensitizer repressor literature, which is sensitizers are the people that watch the needle drawing the blood, and the repressors are the ones that look the other way. And so you can tell immediately when a clinician is working with you, if you want more information, if you're a sensitizer, you're going to do better clinically with more information. And if you're a repressor, you're going to do better clinically if you have less information. So I think I'm a repressor, because this morning I had a CAT scan and they couldn't get the needle in for to give me the intravenous. So they had to do it a couple of times, and I kept closing my eyes and looking the other way. So I learned this morning that I'm a repressor. So they didn't talk to me. They didn't say, you know, I'm doing this now and I'm going to do that now. They knew from my nonverbal signals that how they needed to treat me. And I think that's happening a lot in the hospitals, because I have a few friends who are in the hospital for COVID, and they say, you know, a couple of them who I know are sensitized. So they want to know everything about what's going on from every clinician, everyone is in contact with them. And the repressors just want to know when they're going home, and they don't want to know anything in between being there and going home. So I think that's an important dimension I just want to mention.
So your point raises, thanks for that different perspective, your point raises the notion that, rather to the question, is part of the work is really understanding where people are, or how they're situated. So you can also help them come up with and ask the questions that help them build resilience, whatever their particular style or strategy may be in a given moment. Because I could imagine, Dr. Field, that somebody could be a one or the other, depending on the circumstance. I may not want to know anything about a medical condition, but I want to know everything about the impact of something in an organization or something like that, or vice versa, right? So you may be different in different situations. Anne, did you want to add anything to this question? I know you've also worked in a different particular field where this might be applicable. And I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was working on that. While I was thinking, I was pressing buttons. My experience is very similar, especially if you're in a position of leadership. You have to choose not to react yet. And the first thing you have to think about are the people and then the organization. And then you can figure out how you feel, because they will take their cues from their leadership, how their leadership is acting, if they're getting stuff done, if they're going to it, if they're just huddling and making plans and being about progressive work, and this is how we're going to take care of it. And in our case, it was kind of weird. They sat us down and said, well, you don't qualify to work from home, so we're not sure what we're going to do. But they have a policy that says you can't give a performance appraisal above like 8. And 8 is required, an 8 or above is required, but you can't get an 8. So none of us would qualify to work from home. So I said, how about you take that back to them and they can decide if they want to put us in danger or not, because that has nothing to do with anything really. Why are you punishing us, you're penalizing us because of a circumstance that's not our choice, that have nothing to do, we're not choosing that we want to work from home. We're saying there's a problem and we need not be together. Thank you. So yeah, it just depends on how they handle it. Leadership is a good
example of a lack of agility in the moment, right? Like the systems they had in operation were no longer going to be able to support the circumstances for which suddenly the organization was facing. It happens all the time in a less dramatic way, right? Yeah,
they were really not prepared, and they had to do like load testing without preparation on a VPN thing that was just not ready for it. It was interesting. But we got back to normal within 4 or 5 days, and then I guess they're all okay now, but we had to sign a waiver because we're working from home. Other than that.
Right.
But anyway.
And, that's a good example. Dr. Carly, did you want to weigh in also? I'm sorry, Dr. Field, go ahead.
Well, no, I just was thinking about how frustrating it must be for couples when one person is allowed to work at home and the other person isn't. And how do they manage that? How do they coordinate that? Especially in relationship, if they have children and one person is allowed to work at home, does that mean that all the responsibility is on the other person to do the caregiving for the kids and the homework, et cetera? So I think it's been really a hard struggle for a lot of people with that situation that you're talking about, Anne, where you don't know if you can work at home or not.
Yeah, my parents were, for a week before I actually got to start working from home, we're telling about suggesting that I go to my work, and I tell them, you have people at home that are in this vulnerable population, so you need to tell them that you have to work from home. And I'm like, we have a policy, they're working it out. When they get there, we'll get there, but not yet. I'm sorry. I'll make sure to take a shower every day when I come home. And they're like, but what about you? You've got MS. You've got it. You know, you're part of that population. It's like, they'll work it out. I'll take care of myself. I promise to wash my hands. You know, I'm lucky. I don't have children in this particular circumstance. All you parents out there, I feel for you.
Another point you raised too that I think is really a heart moment for a lot of people right now is the economic circumstance. I mean, a lot of people are dealing with first time, maybe second time job loss. Some people on this very webinar today, and I think it's worthy to say, you know, your point about not responding right away because you're trying to process what's happening to you, and you may be in a context. You may have lost your job and you have kids and you have a spouse that maybe can work, can't work, whatever the situation is. It throws you under normal circumstances that would throw you for a loop, but with the stay at home and all the huge changes, it's hard to engage in the world in any kind of what you might see as a normal, right, with any normality. I think that's something that we have to understand as a community, to go to Dr. Sonnet's ideas around collective, that we may deal with people individually, but there's a whole context behind each person's individual circumstance that we are not aware of at any given time. And I hope that sparks more of a sense of compassion for what many people may be facing that we never really see. I wanted to ask, Dr. Corley, you wanted to say something.
Yes, and I'm glad that I heard this discussion up to this point because especially what Anne was discussing, you know, everyone has their own capacity to respond to different circumstances. And how I respond or how Erica responds, because someone asked in an earlier question and I just responded individually, but like across a life course, what may have worked for us earlier may not work in this circumstance. So, you know, how I as a child might have dealt with, say, loneliness and isolation from, you know, feeling rejected by peers, let's say, for example. Well, now, you know, in a situation where I'm learning how to reach out and create new kinds of communities, and understanding that some communities that I might be in because they fit my needs right now, they may not be the communities face to face that I would, you know, want to connect with. And so it's important to understand not only are there individual variations in how we may manifest resilience, but differences in circumstances. And I want to address this point too that you were following up with, Katrina. So, you know, not everyone wants to share information about what they're experiencing. And then on the other extreme, maybe some people would like to share but don't feel that safety or comfort because this is such an unusual circumstance that we're facing. I mean, all of us here, there might be a few people in the world who lived through, I understand there was somebody who survived the 1918 pandemic and the most current one, but very few people have lived through these circumstances, but some people have lived through, you know, horrendous atrocities. So we have to respect the fact that however people have developed their coping skills and whatever their boundaries are they're setting, that it's really important to have this compassion and to be open to the fact that whatever somebody's experiencing right now, whatever their reactions may not be representative of their full repertoire of behavior. So I like that idea of compassion and really having openness and space for our individual responses and variations.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you too about raising it as a more of a complex picture as well. I know there's many more questions, so I want to continue to move us through the questions. And just to let all the attendees know that any questions unanswered, we will answer and send you responses in our communication. That includes the PowerPoint, the recording, list of resources as well. So moderator, one of our moderators, want to take this on?
Thank you, President Rogers. All right, next question is from Carrie Arnold. She says, I see people wrestling with resilience as being the same as positive thinking, which can be a false coping mechanism to avoid suffering. Her question is, what are ways you explain that the polarity of positivity and negativity can exist within resilience?
Great question, Carrie. Thanks. Good to see you on the call today. I'm one of our graduates. Who'd like to take that one? It's a good and deep question. Optimism, same as resilience, or as you said, positivity, which could be, is that a false hope, a false characterization?
Optimism, pessimism is the same kind of continuum. And I would just like to share a paper that was published in Psychology Today several years ago that showed that in every epidemic that we've experienced, everything from smallpox to polio to scarlet fever, the curve has gone up and then gone down before the vaccine was introduced. The vaccine was introduced on the downside of the curve, very, very low to the bottom, because it takes a long time to come up with a vaccine, of course, we know. And so this author of this paper was saying, basically, it's optimism and the will to live that got all these people through these epidemics before the vaccine was introduced. And so I just wanted to say that as a kind of a positive note, because I was really shocked to see these data. And so I'm hoping that even the wow, before we have this vaccine, we're going to be on the down curve.
Thank you. I hadn't heard of that research before. If we could include that in the resources, that would be very helpful. Other presenters, comments?
Sure. This is Marie. I really like this wrestling with the notions of both being positive and negative. And I think positive thinking is, it's part of the believing through experience that we will get through this. So it's not naive positive thinking when we think of resilience, as I understand it. It's based on, we've been through things before, we will get through this. The opposite is catastrophizing, which might freeze us or paralyze us, that we're not going to be able to do it. It's going to be horrible. My parents are going to die. That type of thinking, catastrophizing, can really freeze us and would be, I would say, an opposite to thinking with capability. We can and we will, and we'll figure it out. So I wouldn't say it's a false coping mechanism, but I would say it would be I don't think positive thinking by itself doesn't exactly capture it. So that's where I would kind of come down on that continuum.
I suppose the opposite of a kind of catastrophic way of thinking is magical thinking, right? And there is certainly a distinction between positive thinking, I like the way you put it, with capability, as opposed to magical thinking, which could also put you in a sense of paralysis. I don't have to do anything.
Absolutely.
It's all going to go away. Right.
Thank you. Yes.
Any other comments from others?
I'd like to share a story from Erica's life, because I think, as I mentioned at the outset, she's really, in a way, my resilience mentor. Figured if she can make it to 99, and she is in a nursing home, thankfully, the nursing home she's in took very quick action to do testing and so on and so forth, because Los Angeles has been really a real hotspot for older adults and people who are vulnerable in various ways. But she shared a story about being in a lineup. So she was almost in a concentration camp. And what she ended up doing is she kept getting behind the person in front of her so that she wasn't in the line, because they were sending people, it was called the brick factory. And, maybe they only had so much space, but there was someone behind the desk who had a list of people. And if their name was on that list, that meant they had a Swedish passport. Some of you may know about Raoul Wallenberg, who she didn't even know who he was until years later. And she became the very last person. And then he said, tell me your name. And her name wasn't on the list, but he decided to save her life. And he said, okay, and gave her a Schutzpass is what it was called. which was a fake Swedish passport. So somehow in that moment, I mean, I don't know if you would call it positive thinking or cleverness or that survival instinct, but she felt like if she could just do something to avoid the possible inevitability of being sent to the brick factory and dying. So I don't know what you would call that. I think positive thinking, it gets a little bit of a bad rap in the sense that, you know, there's no such thing as, no one's positive all the time. In fact, human beings have a negativity bias. This is positive psychologists tell us that we tend to think more in the negative. And so this idea, as Marie was saying, you know, catastrophizing kind of goes off into, if you will, a fear-based thinking about possibilities that they call fear, false evidence appearing real, FEAR, false evidence appearing real, but yet caution and concern about our safety, that is part of our survival mechanism. So I think it's important to distinguish and be less concerned about, you know, is this positive thinking or not? Somebody put Viktor Frankl in the chat, and if he didn't have some feeling that there was something that could happen that would come out of this experience of being in the Holocaust, he probably would not have survived. So this is very rich discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of other French philosophers, for instance, to Viktor Frankl's point, who emphasized that in this way you're always free, because you're always free to choose how you think about something. No matter how difficult, how impossible the circumstances, that is a habit of mind, if you will. And maybe we can take from that a quality that we can use to build resilience. I'd like to see, I know there's other questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. Moderators, do you have another one for us?
Yes. Ralph Chowder asks, isn't resilience just another word for survival?
Okay, so how would we frame that? And excuse me, if I stopped your video, it was only because we were having slight instability, but I think we're fine now. So who'd like to take that on? Is resilience just another word for surviving, getting by, making it happen?
Along the lines of also what the last question, those are actually pretty close. Kristen Boilini and said, we have agency, and Don Murphy said that it takes radical hope. And I think that that's more along the lines of what I was talking about also. It's not that I'm super positive, and it is about survival. And I know that if I don't make choices, then I'm not participating in my survival or in my next best step, whatever that best step is, even if it's a crummy best step. If I don't participate, then that's on me. And that's where it comes from for me for survival.
I think of survival as clearly one aspect of, but I think it's that plus more, right? I think obviously if you're surviving, we're all just surviving. That's a resilient characteristic, right? We're not giving up. We're not emotionally giving up. We're not giving in. We're not killing ourselves. We're not. That's a kind of survival, and certainly that's an aspect of resilience. And I think it's more than that. And I think it's moving from sometimes in your life, that's all you can do, and that's that, you know, you can put as an individual one step in front of another, or as an organization, you're just trying to deal with what's right in front of you. That you can't get to some big vision, you can't get to thriving, but you can at least survive, and that's sort of the minimum basic foundational aspects of resilience. And I think of resilience as also that leaning into that ability to be adaptive too, that agility that you're cultivating. On my slide, I listed lean, agile, and STEP, and somebody asked, what is that? Those are more or less different project methodologies or ways to think about change. And what they have in common is the ability to be agile, flexible, and continue to formulate adaptive strategies within organizations. And I think that as a plus, then, you know, that then takes you beyond survival into a thriving stage. Any other comments on this? I think Marie, you might have wanted to say something on that.
Thank you, Katrina. I don't think my video is on, but I did want to just highlight Oh, there we go. I want to highlight one of our authors, our co-author, Ziva Convisor, has noted in the chat something along that would be very germane right now. And she notes that resilience is the ability to recover or even reconfigure one's life and live next to or alongside and move forward with feelings of grief, pain, and helplessness. And I think in her article is so beautiful about moving forward. Her article is about Holocaust survivors and moving forward, surviving, but with much more deeply held feelings alongside those deeply held feelings of grief, pain, and helplessness. So there's a convergence of both the ability to sustain oneself and move forward at the same time living alongside those feelings. So survival has a lot of depth to that experience.
So I think
Thank you.
survival is very instinctual, and we all have it from the moment we're born, and we have it until the moment we die. And I think that none of us wants to die because we don't know what's going to happen afterwards, and we're going to miss this life. And I just committed someone to the ICU yesterday, an 83-year-old man who was dying, and I asked him the question, you know, do you want to die? And he said, well, could you just tell me when the sailing club is opening again? I said, oh, I don't think you want to die. I think you want to survive. And that was the moment that gave me that made me decide that I was going to call the life squad and have him taken to the ICU. So I think that survival is very instinctual. It's with all of us, and if we can have resilience, we can do better at surviving. I think that was a good message that you just said, Connie.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to another question, moderators.
Next question is from Lisa Rivera. She asks, any best practices towards supporting resilience in others with limited resources previously, now in a delicate balance of providing for basic needs in their lives while supporting others? Also, she notes related to cultural and gender-based values in communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good and deep question. How do we help others, or how do we ask the kinds of questions that help others develop their resilient skills right now, when maybe it's about the basics, maybe on one level, and it's also mediated by culture, race, and other attributes that we may evidence. I think, Connie, you wanted to speak to this.
Yes. Well, I think first of all, it's very important to recognize that in communities, and sometimes people are already in their own natural communities. It might be their families and neighborhoods. It might be their faith or spiritual traditions and communities and so on. So it's really important to help people recognize that they already have support systems in place when they do. Not everyone does. And so I feel that what I'm seeing in a lot of even newspapers, or as I was just looking at yesterday's LA Times, you know, like kind of what are your experiences? People are trying to look at what are these creative responses that other people may not even think about. Like, in fact, yesterday I was sitting out on my front porch. Now that I'm home more, the weather's warmer, you know, I see neighbors that I haven't seen for a while. And there was a neighbor who used to walk around the block when he had a dog. The dog died. And then recently I haven't seen him at all. And it turns out he must be ill, because I saw ambulances and fire trucks, and I went over and they told me he was okay. But we used to have a neighborhood watch, but then the city of San Gabriel centralized it. So I no longer get the names and addresses of people. So now I'm starting to think, you know, maybe we need a neighborhood watch again that's really right here in our very block. So if you think about ways in which communities have developed these sorts of responses, but then over time things have shifted, And there is a lot of great technology. There's something called the Next Door. Somebody told me about there. It's an app. So I signed up for that. But I'm a little cautious about saying too much about my individual circumstance because, living alone does make me more vulnerable. I don't want people that I don't really know, even if they live a block away, I don't necessarily know or trust these people. So I think if we look at how people develop their own natural and community and collective responses, but also through those examples, sharing those with people, letting other people know how they're developing and thriving, I think that's how we're going to learn and not only navigate what we're going through now, but this isn't the first time in many of our lifetimes that we're going to see some devastation that we have to deal with, whether it's an collective experience like we have now or personal experiences.
Yeah, thank you.
Sharing the stories.
Yeah.
I think is important.
I would add to that too. I have 3 brothers who all lost their jobs since March, and they're all older than me, and so they're in that increasingly precarious existence, right? This increasingly precarious economy for them. And one of the things that I'm learning is the value of staying connected, because there's something about job loss, perhaps this is obviously individual variation, where it could also feel like a personal failure, no matter what the circumstances. And it's important to stay connected and to keep normalizing that, there are things you can do. That it goes back to that old notion about what's your zone of control, things you actually do have power over, and what's your sphere of influence, things you can influence. So you start small, like, well, what are your basic needs? How can we help? How can you connect with others that help you get those needs met? And it reminds me about Anne's point about how hard it is to ask for help. And yet that is a strategy for resilience, right? It is in the toolkit, as Marie would point out in her earlier presentation. It's a way in which you can secure support that also normalizes the situation that I'm not normal, I didn't fail, I didn't, it can help counter a lot of that negativity that one may start to internalize the circumstances in which they find themselves. Other comments to this point, because I think it's a very important one, I'm sure is on the mind of many attendees. Marie, anything you'd add to this?
I think you're very wise to think about what are those everyday things that reinforce our ability to work through what's in front of us. And it's interesting because it's a backwards look. What have I been able to work through already, and how did I do that? As well as the forward look, what is in front of me that I need to tackle and learn from, and where do I get my strength? Where do I get that energy to tackle it? And often that comes, of course, from that community, that collective that we've been sharing about.
Thank you. I don't know if Dr. Field would talk about this as psychological response, but I've observed through experience that some people also find it actually helpful to think through her worst case scenarios. Some people don't, but others think, well, if that's the worst case scenario, I can somehow cope better with the current circumstances, right? So for some people, that is a good coping mechanism. Dr. Field, anything from a psychological standpoint that you would add here?
Well, again, I think, it's a continuum, and we all go through various stages of experiencing crises and not knowing what we're going to do, and as Connie said, going back to our experiences and moving forward to what we think worked in the past will work again. There's not a whole lot of literature on, most of the stuff on crises has to do with natural disasters like hurricanes and the PTSD that comes from that. So what we're experiencing now is, I don't think anyone's experienced this since 1918, and most of those people aren't still alive. So this is a whole different kind of experience. We don't know how long this is going to last. We have to have endurance and resilience every single day for 24/7. And it's not like a hurricane. I've experienced, well, Hurricane Andrew, which was one of the worst. And somehow we knew it was going to be over in 21 days. And so, we climb over the electrical lines and we wash our hair in the black water in the pool and do all the stuff that we had to do. But this is a very prolonged endurance that we have to experience. And I think our resilience has to be right up there as much as we have, whatever resources we can pull out to go through this and endure. I'm trying to be positive, but it is going to be a struggle, a continuing struggle.
Scholars will certainly be unpacking this whole circumstance and situation from a global perspective for many decades to come in terms of what communities did better, what nations did better, what societies, what organizations, and why. There was a comment on the chat just now, I think it was John Miner, but it just flashed up on the screen, making the point that resilience is not something you build in the moment. It's that old adage that adversity reveals character as much as it develops it. That resilience, it comes in handy, but you have to build it as you go. It's not something that you can grab in the moment. And so if you have a thin infrastructure or you've been isolated right along and no community connection, it makes it awfully hard to reach out and because you don't have that resilience framework, right? So it's a good reminder that this is something we need to be doing all of the time as adults moving through a system. And what can we do not only for ourselves, but for others and with others? It's that power of the collective. Any other comments? No, let's move on to the next question.
Ana Paula de Alfredo shares that most leaders that she talks to right now are facing difficulties to be resilient and to keep their teams motivated. Should the approach change from individual to a more collective approach?
Now, what do you think, presenters? It's a very good question. What's first? Marie, why don't you take that? Looks like you're ready to lean forward.
Yeah, I think yes. I think the answer is tap into the power of the collective or the community resilience. It's there. I think it's often unrecognized, but it's very powerful. Those connections between us, those dynamic vibrations that work between us that end up in things like trust and respect are very important in times like this. And again, those things aren't things you can just create suddenly. So tap into those. You probably, as Dr. Rogers has said, they're probably they're present in an organization, so there's probably already strength, but we might not be tapping into them because we haven't actually made them visible so that we can act on them. We can actually, take full advantage of them. So I would say, look for the resilient strengths you have collectively, tap into them, emphasize them, and then ask, what do we have in that toolkit that we can use in this very difficult moment?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Connie?
Yes, I think also the notion of collective response is to think outside the box, if you will. So there might be connections that you hadn't thought about before that can naturally arise. And even within one's own family, it's kind of interesting because if you think about, and I know not everyone here lives in the United States, we have people in Canada, but let's just say sort of in a sort of Western frame of reference, there is a very, especially in the United States, very individualistic kind of orientation. You know, I can do this, I've got this. And I'm the kind of person, I have a really hard time asking people for help. It makes me feel kind of vulnerable, or like, now what do I have to do because someone's helped me? And I think that if we see that we are all in need, just to basically say, everybody has needs right now. For some, it might just be the need to feel safe. So I haven't been to a grocery store for 2 months, and I just find other ways. Either I ask people if they're going shopping, that type of thing. And so that's sort of an, if you will, an easy ask. but there are ways that people can help each other. And I think part of it is as an individual looking for those opportunities or creating new networks. And for others, it's going to be how on governmental levels, on organizational, like in our university, how can we as a fielding community, since most of us here, I presume, are part of our fielding community in some way, are there needs that we haven't thought about that we're not reaching out to? We tend to focus on the things that we're just doing because of our job description as an institution, but there might be many other things that we can be doing that we haven't thought about. So how as a collective, so like just as Katrina Rogers pointed out, we're going to take everything that's generated here and look and see, maybe there are things that we hadn't thought about, but this is one way to get this information. So I definitely feel collective response has been the way that we're going to get through this crisis together.
So I think we have been more connecting with our fellow faculty and our students during this period. That's my impression that that's happening. And I know in the survey, people were saying more than 80% were saying they're connecting with friends. They're looking for old friends from their past and connecting with them on Zoom. I think Zoom has been a miraculous medium for all of us to reconnect with our students, faculty, our friends, everyone, besides going to yoga classes.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you. I mean, these are very good insights, I think, and they help you in your own, I hope in your own reflective strategies as attendees and participants, that we focus in on how do all of the collective wisdom here represented by our presenters in the room today, how can they be applied to your own context? I'd like to take one more question. And why don't we do one more question and have all the presenters come back, and then we can answer that question and do a little bit of a wrap up. So we conclude at the top of the hour. So one more moderator, one more question.
All right, this last question is from Stephen Redman. And he asks, what standards or criteria are we using to determine what resilience is? He also asks, what can we learn from people who thrive in high-risk, dangerous environments and circumstances that are their normal, not the new normal?
Hi, Stephen. Good to have you on the call, and thanks for asking two very deep questions. Appreciate it. It'll be a good challenge for our panelists. So who'd like to go first? And shall we take, so first question relates to, could you repeat it again? I'm sorry, Brian. It was
yes. What standards?
Characteristics?
Yes. What standards or criteria are we using to determine what resilience is?
Right. Criteria for determining resilience, and then the second is what can we learn from those who are resilient in very high-risk environments? And that's where their world is and where they live. So, what does the research tell us, and what do we know from our own experience? Marie, looks like you're off mute.
Well, I would say that the literature, there's a robust literature on trying to define resilience and what criteria are the definitive criteria for examining resilience. There's more, there's deep work, decades of work on individual resilience, and that is in the literature. And there are scales and studies using those scales, validating scales. I would say that's extremely well developed. On the organizational side, the community side, that is a literature that has become very robust, and I think in this era of the pandemic, we're going to see, as Dr. Rogers said, much more research. But there are scales, and there are works that dig deeply into what criteria makes an organization or a community resilient. Certainly, some of the work that I did on finding beliefs and behaviors that are common to resilient organizations, for example. I feel pretty good about having found all of those in that literature. So I think there is good work that's being done, but everyone has to start with what is your definition that you're going to be using, because there is a variety.
And I think in the book that was recently published by Fielding University Press, and somebody asked if we have an academic press, and the answer is yes, called Resilience, edited by Connie and Marie, and a collection of essays. That there's a lot there. Almost every single essay starts with a set of what are those criteria. So I really invite you to look at that, and we'll list that in the resources as well. I know one of the things is one attribute is clearly a criteria you look for is the extent to which an individual has a worldview that embodies an emotional complexity. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation the importance of really being able to hold both negative and positive emotions and both participate, feel that, but also be observing that at the same time. So it's that ability to cultivate living in your moment, feeling how you feel, and a sense of detachment about that feeling. So it's that ability to cultivate that metacognition that is an important criteria for resilience. And one might be able to argue, it sounds like you're saying that this is backed up by research, but that's true in organizations as well. Connie, would you like to take this aspect of these two questions, please?
Yes, and I'll be relatively brief because I also want to make sure I can read my quote from Erica before we end. But,
yeah, that's my intention of getting us there.
Okay, thank you. I believe, very just briefly, we have an opportunity right now to look at what is already, in our literature, because there's a lot of people define resilience a lot of ways, but what research has been done, and then how in this extraordinary time. Think of the first responders, think of the people in hospitals seeing, immense numbers of patients in very dire circumstances that they haven't before. We have a natural opportunity here, unfortunately, to make some contributions to literature. So perhaps out of this will come some of that work.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Anne, did you want to add here?
I had a chance to hear Anne.
That's okay. Yeah, I'll get you right back to you, Connie, so you can do that. It's as John Miner in the chat was saying. What are your resources? What are your assets? What do you have at your disposal? And then where can you find others? And so 3 questions back, one of my main things would say, find out from your local government, from your county government, or from your state government what resources are available to you, whether you're a student or a parent or whatever the case may be. I mean, they've got free electric right now. They've got free cell phone bills. They've got free insurance. There's all kinds of things out there. If you have to go look for it. And to Katrina's point earlier, for myself at least, I think in addition to these very scholarly definitions, adaptability has a lot to do with resilience. And I don't think you can have that without being able to adapt. Back to you, Connie.
One more thing, Tiffany, last word here before we go to Connie's close.
I relate to what Anne just said, and I relate to what you said about compassion. And I would just like to bring up empathy, because I think that our first responders, they have been amazing. And I think that one of the qualities that they've had for resilience is empathy, and being able to put themselves in the position of where they can do for everyone else what they would do for themselves. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you. It's a beautiful ending to this excellent webinar and conversation. I want to thank all the presenters very much for all of the points that you've raised. I really appreciate the way that you've woven the personal and community orientations, metaphors, collective, indigenous communities and ways of knowing and being, an acceptance and an openness for many different ideas, those expressed in the chat, for sticking with us through the whole time and asking excellent questions. I just want to remind everyone that we will send the PowerPoint, the recording, the answers to Q&A, and a set of resources, and we'll annotate a few of them so you'll know, like if one is specific to criteria, some of the other things that are raised in the chat and Q&A. We're a learning community. We're modeling the way on that. We ourselves are trying to build our own resilience and adaptation as we go, and this is just one example. So thank you again, all of you. And I also want to now turn it over to Connie, who's going to give us a Oh, first she's going to show, right, the Fielding
Well, this
Scholar
is the
Practitioner,
cover
another
of-
publication of the press. And Connie's going to read something from this. So please go ahead, Connie, and this will conclude our talk for today.
Yes, just a 1-minute quote from the Fielding Scholar Practitioner, the penultimate chapter, chapter 28. This is from Erica Leon at the end of her memoir. I wrote my memories for my grandchildren, Evi and Akos. I want them to remember that there is hope always in life. There is music and nature. In these, you will never be disappointed. Life is full of wonderful things along with the tragic ones. You just have to discover the beauty and love in life. There is no sunshine without shade and no shade without sunshine. Everything is gray when we don't have both of them. We cannot enjoy constant happiness. We're only aware of the difference when we compare it with our troubled times. The shell has to suffer to produce the pearl, and so it is with our soul. Suffering makes it valuable. Many times, what seems to be bad turns out to be for our benefit. We just have to wait and see. So thank you, Erica Leon, and again, thank you, Fielding University Press, for making it possible to share some of our work and hopefully more going forward.
Yeah, thank you all, and do feel free to continue to stay connected to these conversations. Please, can we give a virtual hand to our presenters today? Thank you for all your time.
Thank you
For the
very much.
rest of you,
Thank you.
have a safe evening, afternoon, and a good week. Wishing you all a good week. Thanks again for your commitment to this work. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
participating and attending,
Thank
and
you.
for the organizers or moderators. Thank you again. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.